I'm Ted Tomasi. I'm a managing principal at Integral Consulting and head of the Environmental and Natural Resource Economics program. I've written 3 papers over the last 6 months or so on environmental justice in natural resource damage assessment. They're a little long, they're a little complicated, so I thought I'd do a simple presentation that would focus on the central ideas associated with these writings. Natural resource damage assessment is a little bit of a different area in environmental policy analysis in the law, in which there is an injury that occurs to natural resources from an oil spill or historic releases of contaminants of some kind. And the public needs to be compensated for that by government agencies acting on behalf of the public, will recover monies from those responsible for the release of the contamination, and then spend that much money on restoration in order to compensate for the injuries from the contaminant. So the key issue is how much restoration is enough. And that's called restoration scaling. And what these papers are about is building a concern for environmental justice into the scaling process and these determinations about how much restoration is enough. So we're going to focus on restoring the public, but then we're also going to add an additional consideration, which is a desire to reduce inequalities in the resource base and access to resources as we're deciding how much and where to do restoration. And we're going to think about that as if we were to make a transfer from those who are relatively well endowed with resources over to those who are less well endowed. And that was a balanced transfer. It's the same amount being transferred from, taken from one and given to the other. Then we would judge that that would raise social well-being overall, all else equal. So just that single additional consideration is what we're going to add to what we normally do when we're doing restoration scaling. I'm going to illustrate this with a model of recreation or cultural use of resources. It's a little simpler than ecological issues. I have a paper on that, one of my papers on that topic. But if you understand it in this setting, you're a leg up on understanding it in the ecological setting. And I'm going to use a super simple model, stripped down, tinker toy kind of world in which we can really understand the basics before we add all the complications that we'd normally face in the real world. So I'm going to start here with these 4 communities, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The size of the circle is the amount of recreation resources that they have available to them in acres. So A in 2 is the amount of acres for community 2, and it's modest in size. Community 1 is the most resource poor, and community 4 is resource rich. They have lots of acres. And in recreation economics, there's a relationship between the availability of the resource to you, how many beaches or parks or areas to fish are available to you within a given distance, because you have to leave your home and you have to go to them, which incurs, in essence, a price or a cost of travel. And you see here that the length of the arrow is an index of the price or the cost of getting access. So a community 1, which doesn't have many resources, on average, they have to travel from wherever they live quite a ways to get there. So they have a high price, whereas very resource-rich communities, lots of beaches, lots of parks nearby, don't have to go far to get one. And we have a relationship among those, and in our real simple version here, we're going to that's the only thing that differs across all these communities. In all other respects, they're going to be the same, unless I note otherwise. That's going to simplify matters for us. And we can plot a relationship between the cost of travel, like a price. If you're going to buy an apple, you go into a store, you have to pay the price in order to have the apple. Here, the price is the cost of time and money to go to the recreation site. And that will govern how many trips you take. When you're deciding whether to take another trip, you're balancing off the extra enjoyment of recreating against the cost of doing it. And so you have this relationship that when the price is high, you don't take many trips, and when the price is low, you take more trips. It's called the demand curve. Community 2 here has this number of acres and that price, so they're a point here that on this relationship between price and trips, and we can fill in the rest. It's called the demand curve. So those with a high price, this community takes very few trips. Those with low price, this community takes lots of trips. And what economic theory shows is that this demand curve is actually a trade-off between money and enjoyment, and the net amount of payoff that I have is this triangle. Each trip generates a willingness to pay that much money in order to take the trip, and all of them here. But if I lose the opportunity to go, this is the amount of money that I'm spending, the price times the quantity, that's my expenditure. If I lose the opportunity to go, I still have this money. What I lose is this extra enjoyment up here called consumer surplus. That's the willingness to pay to have a given size park. So community 2 would be willing to give up this amount of money in order to have that amount of park there versus none at all. It's an index of the community's well-being that's associated with availability of parks. And you can see, of course, that if you have low acreage and you have a high price, this price comes up, you have a teeny little triangle. Not much well-being. These folks who are well endowed with resources have a very low price. They're down here, they have a very low price and they have a huge triangle. They have a lot of well-being generated by recreating. And this willingness to pay is an index of those differences in well-being. So, imagine now that we have an injury. We're going to shrink the amount of recreation, say, in Community 3. An oil spill closes beaches, discovery contamination in parks. You may close the park or have advisories. So it's effectively a reduction in the amount of acres. So what does that do? If I have to travel now all the way into the inner circle after the injury, I have a higher price. So that's effectively here, moving from my baseline price. Baseline will always be in blue, or B for baseline. And the injury raises the price. So my triangle used to be big, and now it's small, and the change in the triangle is the change in my well-being, monetized as a willingness to accept, to endure the injury. That is, if you had the small circle of that much more money, you'd be just as well off as if you had the big circle but less money. It's your willingness to make that trade. So we now have an idea of how much society is worse off due to the injury. Now let's suppose that we do restoration over here in another community where we go from the baseline, which is a small amount, to the restored area, which is bigger, the green area. We're going to lower the price from the length of the blue arrow to the length of the green arrow. The price here is going to go down. My triangle, which was tiny, I had low well-being initially because I was resource poor. Now it goes down here and I have a willingness to pay to obtain that restoration. That's how much money Community 1 would give up in order to have the restoration versus not. So we have this idea of well-being across these communities. We're adding them up as a total well-being. And total well-being would be the same as at baseline, just the blue circles, as it would be if we had an injury here and a restoration there, if the triangles all added up to what they were at baseline. That's going to happen if this willingness to pay is the same as this willingness to accept. So having injured community 3, I have to restore how much in community 1, if I choose to do it there? Enough so that that willingness to pay matches that willingness to accept, which reestablishes the sum of willingness to pay across all the communities. That's the traditional way of scaling. It's called value-to-value scaling, kind of obviously. The value lost and the value gained are equated in economic terms, and that tells you how much restoration you should do. So, there are a lot of different projects that will do this. We could put it in different communities, different sizes. Clearly, willingness to pay would be at least as great as willingness to accept. If we did more, we shouldn't do more than we need to. So we have different criteria about how we might do it. And one criteria would put it back in community 3. That's called nexus. That criteria would reestablish the original distribution. But that forgoes an opportunity. It's restoring communities 3 well-being, which is already high, and forgoes the opportunity to enhance the disadvantaged. And that's the EJ connection. So another criterion, as I talked about, was, well, you don't want to do too much. Cost effectiveness says, if you have 2 projects, both of which will restore the public, but one is cheaper than the other, then you should do that project. Well, imagine that community 4 here is super cheap. It's very close to community 3. Cost effectiveness would say, put it in community 4. If you didn't do that, you could make everyone as well off as they were at baseline and have something left over and make everybody better off. So cost effectiveness kind of conflicts with the nexus idea, that criterion, but it clearly would conflict in this circumstance with an EJ criterion because you'd be putting the restoration in the richest community. So there's this tension across these different criteria for selection. And what these papers are about is, imagine that you had another criterion that was the EJ criterion, where balanced transfers enhance social well-being, not just their sums, and so that we can trade off this equity idea with the efficiency and the idea of compensation. So what we're really doing is, rather than saying, let's just add up simple sums of these willingness to pay measures, let's add a consideration that says balance transfers from the rich to the poor make society as a whole better off. So the traditional approach has implications for environmental justice. I started off saying that these communities are going to be all the same in all regards. Imagine that they're not all the same in all regards. Imagine that they have income differences. We could imagine that 2 communities might have the same amount of resources, but if they had different income, their willingness to pay would be different. That is, if I'm just poor, I can't give up as much income for the enjoyment of resources because I put more weight on being able to buy food and educate my kids and do other things that I have to do. So just the traditional approach, which just adds up these numbers, is actually anti-EJ to the extent that communities differ in income or other things that affect their willingness to pay or willingness to pay for recreation. So ill health, all sorts of different things besides income might affect their willingness to pay for recreation. And the traditional approach doesn't account for any of that. So if we're going to build environmental justice into these considerations, we have to be more cognizant of all the different impacts on willingness to pay besides just how many acres you have. Moreover, when we estimate that demand curve, I put it in there straight. But it could be curved in various ways just from the data and the model that we choose as economists to estimate. So if it looked like this one down here, which is going up in the relationship between willingness to pay and acres, a very small change in acres gives a given amount of change in willingness to pay. Whereas over here, when it's shaped in this concave way rather than convexly, that same amount of willingness to pay, this distance is the same as that distance, needs a whole lot more acres to sustain it. Right? And this approach, things happen to be convex, is anti-EJ. So if we took account of income differences and we happened to estimate a model that looked like that one, it would be a double whammy on EJ. This would be a very anti-EJ, even though it's using all the traditional methods that we typically use in economics. So what we have to do if we're going to build EJ in and consider it actively and positively is we have to ensure that the curve looks like this. Which means that rather than just having a simple sum of willingness to pay over these communities, we have to put a weight on. And the way that we put the weight on is putting emphasis on this balanced transfer. If we put more weight on this community's willingness to pay than this community's willingness to pay, because at baseline they're resource impoverished, that consideration is saying if I took a balanced transfer from here to here, welfare would go up because the weight here is lower where I lose is lower than the weight here where I gain. That balanced transfer has a positive effect, whereas in the traditional way, it won't. So that's what we need to do. And all we're doing then is modifying the original approach by placing weights on a sum. It's not a large change mechanically. So the traditional approach will be fine as long as we have like a straight line between willingness to pay and acres, and everybody has the same acres and everybody has the same income. So if the world looked like this, ethically, the traditional approach would be just fine. We have these four communities here. Ethically, our judgments probably shouldn't differ if we just rename them 4, 3, 2, and 1. So if we change just the names, we shouldn't make fundamental different ethical judgments here. Rather than having these four different communities across space, it's one community across time. All right? So we have 1981 when damages start to accrue under CERCLA. We have now when we do the assessment, 2030 when we would implement restoration, and 2100 generations, 4 generations later from 1981, over which restoration plays out. So if we wouldn't have changed anything by switching 1, 2, 3, and 4 to 4, 3, 2, and 1, we shouldn't change anything ethically by 1981 to 2100 switching places. But discounting does that. When we do an analysis, we take the injuries back in 1981 and we magnify them when we add them up today. And we take the injuries out in the future and we shrink them when we add them up today. Why would we do that? We would agree that we would treat these communities the same, and just if we changed their names, we wouldn't have an ethical judgment. So when we switched 4, 3, 2, and 1 with 1, 2, 3, and 4, we all agreed that there was no ethical implications of doing that. But that's different than discounting, where we're treating 1981 very differently. We're placing more weight on them, and we're taking the future and placing less weight and almost no weight on 2100. And that just seems ethically bizarre in a way. You're discriminating in favor of people or against people depending on when they're born. It's another form of discrimination that just doesn't seem to have a place in decision-making about public trust resources. So we need to think carefully about the ethical implications of the discount rate. The discount rate that we normally apply, 3%, say, in NERDA, has two components. An impatience component that says, irrespective of what you have, if it's in the future, it's just worth less. And if it's in the past, it's just worth more. Well, we just said that that is ethically highly questionable. So we should take out, in my view, the rate of impatience from the discount rate in natural resource damage assessment. It's antithetical to the public trust doctrine. But then the discount also has this term that reflects a change in the resource baseline. All right? So, for example, imagine that back in the day, there were very few resources available, and that over time, resources would expand. Well, willingness to pay is going to be greater when you have few resources for a little bit more than when you're already flush with resources. Right? If I have lots, adding one more doesn't matter much. I mean, when I have lots, adding much more doesn't value much. But when I have very little, taking away a little bit is worth really a lot. So in this case, a transfer of resources from here to here would involve a transfer from somebody poor to a transfer to somebody rich through time, from the impoverished past to the wealthy future. If that's the case, we should have a positive discount rate. However, we could also imagine global warming, that compared to 1981, if this is the number of wetland acres in the Gulf of Mexico, that could be shrinking over time. In which case, our injury occurs when we're relatively flush, it shouldn't be worth much. Our restoration occurs out here when it's worth really a lot because we don't have very much and it's worth really a lot. It's the opposite of this situation. That's a negative discount rate. So when we think about fairness through time in the same way that we thought about environmental justice across space, we have a different view of discounting than we normally apply in NERDA. I think it's fully appropriate that we reconsider the discount rate in light of environmental justice, or more generally, justice through time. So that's one of the other papers that I've produced recently. So, to summarize, when we go about our business in the traditional way, that may increase inequality or decrease it, but it would be as an unintended consequence of what it is that we do in economic modeling. So our ethics there are sort of hidden from view. We can introduce environmental justice as a new criterion for project selection. And it introduces some tension, as we saw, between nexus and cost effectiveness in particular. But it gives us the opportunity to increase equality or reduce inequalities with our decision making about compensatory restoration. We can do this by substantively including environmental justice in restoration planning. And we don't really have to do a whole lot different. It's the same data, it's basically the same methods, but we now add a weight when we're summing up across people that reflects the baseline circumstance. And the amount of weight that we put on environmental justice is a choice, and it's part of the scaling and transparent to all. So our ethical assumptions are laid bare. And this same concerns of adding up across people at one point in time across space based on how much they have also arises when we add up across people who are at different points in time, which is done using a discount rate. And the same kinds of ethical considerations come to the fore. So the discount rate has ethical and fairness implications. It seems to me that including an impatience term in the discount rate is putting a weight on someone based on when they are born, and that is antithetical to the public trust doctrine. So I think we should revisit how we discount. I think we should revisit how we add up across people based on their circumstances. And that's the essence of these 3 papers that I've written. And I hope that this presentation has made it a little bit more clear what I have been writing about. And feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or comments. Thank you very much.